All right, so hello everybody. Thank you for joining. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. And we appreciate you joining us today for this workshop on engaging early career voices and shaping a more equitable future for the science and technology. This is in response to the ideation challenge from OSTP. The time is now, so we'll share the link for that so you can look at while we're going through the event. This event is organized by the Journal of Science Policy and Governance in collaboration with the Science and Technology Policy Program at the Rice University Baker Institute for Public Policy. And we would like to thank them for partnering on this event. So this is the challenge. This workshop is meant to incorporate early career voices into this ideation challenge. The time is now, advancing equity in science and technology. And at the end of this event, we will submit a joint response from the authors and all of you here today to OSTP to this challenge. Now, today's session will feature winning authors from the JSPG special issue that you can see here. That was sponsored by the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the Kavli Foundation. And we published this earlier this year. You can see the issue at the link on the slide and in the chat. Thank you. And what we will do is center our discussions around publications of winning authors who are here today, and the policy changes which they proposed and we'll be discussing in the breakout rooms. Now, you also see here the special issue cover memo was co-authored by AAAS CEO Sudip Parikh and Kavli Foundation President Cynthia Friend. So we encourage you to read the cover memo as well and the articles in the special issue. So also to begin framing the event a little bit, we were fortunate enough to have Dr. Parikh record an introduction for us today. So we'll play that for you now. Hopefully that works. And Dr. Parikh is the CEO of AAAS and also an advisory board member for JSPG.
Hey everybody, my name is Sudip Parikh, and I am the Chief Executive Officer of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or the AAAS, and the Executive Publisher of Science and the Science Family of Journals. I also have the privilege of serving on the advisory board for the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. And I have to tell you, it is always exciting for me to see people contributing to the future of science and technology policy. But it's especially exciting when it's early career scientists and engineers who are going to be directly affected by the policies that we put in place now. So together, we can work to make this future more diverse, more equitable, and more inclusive in order to achieve scientific excellence and reach awe-inspiring heights of understanding beyond any era in human history. I believe that's possible, any era in human history. So I want to congratulate the published authors and winners of the competition from the JSPG special issue on shaping the future of science policy. I'm excited to say that this was done in partnership with all of us at AAAS and the Kavli Foundation. I'm also excited by the fact that you're working with JSPG to take your ideas into action through the White House OSTP Advancing Equity in S&T Ideation Challenge. That's a great opportunity, but there will be more. And as I wrote in an op-ed in Science recently, insisting on inclusion of underrepresented groups neither sacrifices scientific excellence nor diminishes the accomplishments of those who have historically dominated the sciences. To put it another way, highlighting the previously hidden does not invalidate the already admired. But this change requires that the scientific community increase attention and support for those who've been disadvantaged. Look, the challenges and opportunities of this coming era are scarier, truly scarier, and more exciting than any in human history. Any in human history. It's up to us to ensure that we rise to the challenges and build on the opportunities, because there is so much ahead of us. I'm looking forward to seeing some of your policy and ideas enacted right away through this challenge, but also in the future. And while you're doing that, keep in touch with us at AAAS, all right? Thank you very much.
All right, so with that nice introduction, we'll move on to talk a little bit more about the event today. So I didn't actually introduce myself. So my name is Adriana Bankston. I'm currently the CEO and managing publisher for the journal. And you can follow me on Twitter, Adriana Bankston, and JSPG at Stoll Journal. So I want to just give you a little bit of background about the journal if you're not familiar and what we do. So we're an internationally recognized open access and peer-reviewed research publication, as well as a nonprofit. And we publish, obviously, research from early career scientists, students, early career scholars, but we also want to bolster their skills in research and writing and science policy. And today's workshop is meant to take the publications further into engagement in the science policy debate and see what ideas emerge from this session today. So in terms of publications, we publish in a variety of formats, which you can see here: op-eds, technology assessments, policy memos, and so on. And we also promote the publications through our global mailing lists, as well as events, workshops like this, webinars, and the podcast. So you can follow JSPG on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'll post a few of our accounts in the chat. We also have a newsletter where you can sign up to keep in touch with us and our future events and published issues. So just to give a little background on logistics, we always like to share social media information. So if, first of all, if you're not speaking, please mute yourself so we can have attention to the panel that's coming up. And also letting you know that this workshop is being recorded. We encourage you to follow JSPG, AAAS, and the Cowboy Foundation on Twitter, as well as the Baker Institute Public Policy, which is also on the slide. And we always encourage people to tag us and we can amplify the messages based on what you're learning today. And then we also like to share a schedule so you can see what to expect, which will be in the chat as well. We'll have an introduction, panel discussion, and then we'll spend the second half in breakout rooms. So because we did partner with the Baker Institute for this event, I do want to share a little bit about them. So they couldn't join us today, but I can give a brief introduction about the Institute. So they were founded in 1993 as a nonpartisan public policy think tank to build a bridge between the world the world of ideas and the world of action. Is named after James Baker III, former US Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, and White House Chief of Staff. They host a number of research groups working on domestic and international policy topics, such as energy, health, the US-Mexico relationship, and the Science and Technology Policy Program, which supported the event today. They bring together statesmen, scholars, students, and the general public to provide an open forum for debate and discussion. And they have hosted many important figures over the years, including Nelson Mandela and the Dalai Lama. So the Institute itself has grown to be the second highest ranking university affiliated think tank in the world. And as I mentioned, they do focus on translating ideas into action, which is very aligned with what we're doing today. So check them out online as well. And we'll have their website in the chat at bakerinstitute.org. So in the context of today's event, just a little more framing in terms of our partnership with the Institute in seeking to catalyze ideas from the next generation in science policy and putting these ideas into action through this challenge. So another connection to the Baker Institute is that Neil Lane, who is pictured here, is part of JSPG's advisory board. And he is also a senior fellow in the Science and Technology Policy at the Baker Institute. So he was the director of NSF and later served as a science advisor to President Clinton and the director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. So we did want to make this connection and encourage you to view these videos. So earlier this year, We interviewed Neil Lane along with Sudip Parikh and Marshall McNutt, as well as Deborah Wynn Smith, in relation to this special issue on the topic of the future of science policy, which also included a number of early career perspectives. So it's a really nice video. I encourage you to check them out on our YouTube channel. And then we'll place the videos, the links to this in the chat as well, well worth watching as well. So with that, we'll move into our event today, and I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Kate Stoll. Kate is a senior policy advisor at the MIT Washington office. Prior to MIT, she served as an American Chemical Society Congressional Fellow with the US House Committee on Energy and Commerce, and also as a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the NSF. She received her BA in biochemistry and molecular biology from Reed College and her PhD in biochemistry from the University of Washington. And you can follow Kate on Twitter at StollKate at MIT in DC. Kate, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Adriana. I appreciate it. I'm a big fan of JSPG and all the work you do, so I'm really delighted to be here to introduce our panelists who published in the JSPG special issue, as you talked about before, Shaping the Future of Science Policy, and to hear about their visions for a better future for us all, centered on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'll just introduce the three of them briefly, and then we'll get to hear from them firsthand. So first we'll hear from Andrew Crane from University of Georgia, whose publication on science policy in rural America won first place in the competition. And then next we'll hear from Lindsay DeMarchi from Northwestern University, who co-authored an article on diversifying publications into non-English languages. And the publication won second place, and it was also highlighted by Northwestern University in their press. So check those out in the chat. And last but not least, we'll hear from Jeremy Pesner from Carnegie Mellon University, who published on the broad topic of societal impact in tech and research and development. And he really fundamentally rethinks how science engages with society. So I'm excited to hear from all three of these. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the authors to tell us more about their ideas and the implications of them. So Andrew, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
All right, good morning, everyone. And thanks again for joining us this morning. I look forward to engaging in conversation with you. So I just will start by giving a little bit of an overview of my paper and the problem I outlined and what I'm proposing here. The focus of my work, the title I think captures it, is Inclusive Science Policy and Economic Development. And the focus is on rural America. So I do research on rural education, and my background's in the social sciences, but working to link that together with science policy. So basically, the background here is that scientific research over the 20th century wrought many benefits for society. You think about areas like healthcare, telecommunications, economic prosperity, economic growth, and education. But when you look around at some of these areas, this innovation economy or innovation ecosystem is not accessible to everyone in the United States. And so the core problem here that I'm thinking about is specifically the divide between rural and non-rural areas in these in access to these science innovations. So rural and non-rural areas are starkly divided in their ability to benefit from all these innovations. And I basically argue in the paper that rural development initiatives could be more broadly reframed as a form of science policy. So in the next century, maybe our focus should be making sure that everyone geographically has access to all the great things that we're doing. And I focus specifically on education as one policy silo in the paper. Some of my proposed solutions are that we need more sustained federal investment in rural communities. So I talk about how a lot of work, especially in education, is based around short run, 3 to 5 year grant programs that kind of step into these communities and then step out once the grant is over. And so I'm sort of problematizing that and saying we could use more sustained, long-term investment instead of these short-run basic science and outreach programs. More coordinated rural development at the federal level. That's not a new idea. There's been folks that have called for more coordination between, things like broadband internet access and rural healthcare and housing and education. So how can we stitch these together to maximize the effect and the investment? Simplified funding mechanisms for rural education, both at the K-12 and higher ed levels. So, do current funding models kind of disadvantage those who don't have economies of scale in small towns, and how should we maybe streamline or make those more accessible based on focusing more rural settings? And then what policy incentives can we develop to attract science and technology startups to move to rural settings, or to base themselves in rural settings? So there's this issue of kind of diversifying the economy in rural locations, and that's really harmful, because when the economy shifts, maybe companies outsource or what have you, it can devastate entire communities or entire regions. And so we need to think about how we can diversify and sort of spread the wealth in terms of the startup ecosystem. So in the breakout room, I'm thinking of focusing, just sort of teasing these topics out a little bit further, and talking more in depth about what are the policy mechanisms we might specifically use to enact these ideas. How can we attract, for example, startups to relocate? What are some policy incentives that we could use to attract that development? What are the funding mechanisms that truly would be most accessible for rural communities if we were to reimagine or streamline those programs? And then going back to the idea of more coordinated federal development, rural development at the federal level, what would that actually entail if we were to game that out a bit further? So those are some of the things I'm thinking about in terms of the OSTP challenge.
Thanks, Andrew. We're going to hand it over to Lindsay now.
Hi, I'm Lindsay, and it's really a privilege to be here with all of you, some of you who woke up very early to be here today. So thank you for everybody who is so motivated by social good that you would put yourselves in this meeting. Our paper, like I'm representing 4 co-authors, myself included, our paper is very, very simple. It's just based on the idea that science is better when more people can participate. Of course, making that statement more specific is where we get into different policy issues, which is what I hope to brainstorm on together. So really the background is that in academia, particularly STEM academia, there is this enormous burden on individuals who do not speak English as their first language. And even if they were so motivated as to translate their works into other languages, there is a huge financial burden on them to do so. And then if they even cross that hurdle, there is a huge burden as to where to publish their translated versions if they are going a bilingual route. So we were arguing that this causes quite a bit of homogeneity in science, but it is also detrimental to United States science, because when you want to do a background or literature search when you are starting your research, you are missing out on very much of the world's science, because not all of the world can publish in English. So it's a bilateral issue. One of the things that we propose is that there should be more structure from a top-down level for hosting and translating different science into different languages. Of course, some of the specifics that we work out is how would you even choose which languages to translate to? For example, Spanish is the second most spoken language in the United States, but it is not the second most spoken language in astrophysics. So how would we balance what languages people are translating to? There's also a really great quote that if everybody spoke the same language, if science spoke 6,000 different languages like are spoken on Earth, we would actually miss out on a lot of information. So there's a critical point at which it becomes actually detrimental to be publishing in too many languages. So this balance is something that we talk about in the paper, but of course, the actual real world implications are even more complicated when you start to consider maybe even global politics. So 70% of 70% of science is published actually in Chinese and does not get translated to English. And for example, the winner of the Nobel Prize for the cure for malaria a few years ago was actually published in Chinese, and it was because of a serendipitous summarization in English that American authors even heard of it. And so the original paper in Chinese was only cited once outside of China. And so there's a real issue, especially when you consider lost time for the COVID vaccine, where you don't have this communication, but at the same time, it's no secret that American and Chinese science often competes with one another. So how can we work around international politics as well as embracing pure science and the desire to make people's lives better through science? So these are some of the things I wanted to talk about in my breakout room. And thank you again for being here this morning.
Thank you, Lindsay. Jeremy, can you talk about your idea next?
I sure can. There we go. So we all know as graduate students that research and publications are the fundamental backbone of science. We all pursuing research careers, or at least reading a lot of papers, because we recognize the values that papers can provide to society on a high level. However, many people, we were also here because we want to have some kind of meaningful impact on the world. And in many cases, the results of research can seem somewhat divorced from the long-term impact of science and technology. In fact, when the average person thinks about the development of science and technology, research papers aren't usually high at the top of that list. Now, we might think that this is a sort of a result of the research process or something endemic to it, but it was actually sort of a very clear result, a set of clear policies and thoughts created by Vannevar Bush and those he worked with shortly after World War II, who basically said that scientists and science should be divorced from societal concerns and largely only governed by scientists based on what is scientifically interesting. So the result is that we have many, many publications, billions and billions of dollars spent on research, but no clear sense of what the long-term downstream impacts of that are going to be. Now, I will give credit, organizations like the NSF will put out their broader impact criteria, and they'll say, okay, well, how do we think that this research might impact society, broadly speaking? But first off, those are extremely, the ways that they go about that are extremely broad, and they have all sorts of different high-level goals you can choose from. And more importantly, they're assessed by the same scientists assessing the scientific merit of the proposal. And therefore, those scientists are not usually in the best position to judge what the best long-term impact of this science is going to be beyond the resultant paper. So fundamentally, what I argue for in my paper is expanding the judges of any given research proposal to include other stakeholders that would be affected by the science research long-term. If we're talking about, a new type of microchip, for example, who are the stakeholders involved that might use that technology in, 5 to 10 years? If we're talking about research on pollution, well, who are people from that community, the communities affected? How is that research going to affect them in 5 to 10 years? And so on. Some potential questions for my breakout room would be sort of more precise definition of which stakeholders should be involved for which types of science research. I proposed a very broad framework here so that it could be applicable to any type of science research, but that obvious because many different types of science research are done in different ways, and in many cases funded by different agencies, we need to consider some different kinds of combination questions and different types of stakeholders. Another question I would have is how we bring stakeholders up to speed. Scientists have the benefit of knowing the background of the proposals that they're evaluating, other stakeholders not so much. And then thirdly, of course, we have to balance scientific novelty and research and social impact of the research. So how much should one outweigh the other in any given decision? And that would be some of the questions that I would intend for us to discuss today. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy, and thanks to everyone for sharing their ideas. I think they're going to inspire a lot of discussion in the breakout rooms.
Yeah, thanks everybody. So to sort of bring this all together, I want to ask Kate a question about the ideas that were brought here today. We heard really great perspectives about the future of science and technology policy. What is your main takeaway from what the authors discussed, and why are you excited for the future of science policy and their ideas?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's hard to give just one takeaway because the ideas themselves were really diverse in their topic choice and solutions. So that's why I'm particularly excited to hear what we can learn from the breakout sessions. But I suppose one thing that inspires me about all three is the assumption that the status quo doesn't have to persist. We know we can do science better. We know there are specific and actionable ways to make the scientific enterprise and its outcomes more inclusive. And now what we need is the follow through. So these ideas are a great start to that process. And hopefully everyone's seen that, DEI has been a major priority of the Biden administration Office of Science and Technology Policy. I think evidenced in part by this time is now ideation challenge. So, this is a great way to engage. And I want to now turn back to the panelists and ask them, what would you like to see OSTP do to address the issues in your paper? Any thoughts on how they can do it? And any thoughts on how you might be able to evaluate the success of solutions posed, just to get ideas rolling before we jump into the breakout sessions. Andrew?
Sure, yeah. One of the things I did with this paper, I come from a background in higher ed research, and in higher education, there's this sort of thing happening right now where rural students, rural communities are being brought into the conversation about diversity, and colleges and universities are starting to think about how to incorporate rurality as an aspect of DEI. And so I think kind of following on that thread I mentioned of more coordinated kind of federal investment, it would be really interesting for OSTP to step into that space, and to, if the goal is to invest more in DEI and more inclusive approaches to science policy at that level as well, thinking about what that means in terms of geography and rurality. And so this sort of proposal in my paper that rural development could in many ways be reconceptualized as science policy, or science policy being an important facet of rural development, could be really interesting. I mean, I think there have been efforts, of course, at the federal level to cultivate rural development in different ways at a very large scale, but I don't know how much of that has really been conceptualized as science policy. And so OSTP could potentially play a role in articulating that and linking these threads together, in the 21st century, and help, again, kind of delivering these innovations that come from all this investment into various geographic corners of the country.
Thanks, Andrew. I know, Lindsay, you had some thoughts on your paper specifically for OSTP, but did you have thoughts you wanted to share now?
Sure, yeah. Or I guess I could even summarize some that were in the paper. So basically the idea that translation is not going to happen for free, and people should be paid for their time. So a proportion of the grants, like federal grants that are given to researchers, which is like our bread and butter, could go towards paying for translation services, and maybe even down the line, OSTP or other government agencies could negotiate better rates for people who are seeking translations for their papers. I didn't mention, but I do go into in my paper that if you do want to translate your work, you often have to pay quite a lot of money, sometimes up to $10,000, but you also have to barter online because a lot of prices are not publicly posted. So if English is not your first language, you are now bartering with a stranger to get your work translated. So some kind of standardization along that line would be really, really excellent, and a little bit of transparency too. Of course, then there's the decisions of what languages to translate to. It would be nice if that was also standardized in some kind of way that we could maximize resources. And actually, in writing this paper, it was very difficult to collect any kind of meaningful statistics because the demographics of science and lingual diversity in science is actually not well documented and not well known. So part and parcel with what can OSTP do and how can we measure success, it would be really nice if there were dedicated resources to keeping track of this type of diversity. And it's kind of convenient that when you receive a government grant, you do have to report on everything your grant was used for. So one of the things that we propose is just an extra little question that says, like, what language do you and your team speak other than English? So that would be a nice way to evaluate success in the future, is to see if we retain lingual diversity as the years go on, which we would get for free when we get grant reports back.
Thanks, Lindsay. Jeremy, did you want to respond to this question?
Sure. I'll start by quickly giving the inspiration for this paper in the first place. A couple years ago, I was at a non-academic conference, and there was a panel on, science and social impact. So I went to it. Sound very much up my alley. The speakers on the panel were all entrepreneurs and people working in industry, saying, oh, well, I had this science background, so I went and founded this company. Or then I was working in this, and then I pulled in some science research, and then I made my offerings better and improved the world. And that's great. We need people like that. But I noticed that the actual scientists, the actual researchers were absent in that conversation. And so when I asked them, so what about the universities? What about technology transfer? I kind of got middling responses. They didn't really seem to know what to do with that. And that's kind of what made me realize is that, the actual research was kind of given short shrift when we talk about the long-term impact, which is what made me explore this question. So my hope would be through this method would be to sort of, when people think about science and technology, they'll usually think about a tech company, or maybe these days they'll think about Pfizer or Moderna. They're going to think about the stuff that they see in their everyday lives. Research is by and large invisible to the general public. My hope in the long term would be that by bringing different public stakeholders into judging research, that they'll be more aware of what it takes to actually produce some kind of science and technology innovation from the very beginning. And in so doing, they'll understand research better, they'll be able to judge research better, and on the research side, research will be more responsive and attentive to their particular concerns. In terms of how OSTP can help with this, I would say that what we can hopefully tell them is by drawing up a framework, by saying potentially if you're doing this type of research in this field, you might want to consider stakeholders from VC, from the general public, and from, say, legal background. And if you're doing this type of research, you might need to consider someone from higher ed or from journalism. So the idea of saying what types of people do we need for which types of research, potentially which types of funding agencies. And then also maybe taking some crash courses, essentially some kind of Coursera situation where it's okay, you're going to judge a research paper in biology and you have no background in biology. Here's a 2-hour video you can watch to get up to speed on what we think you'll need. That kind of thing.
Thanks, Jeremy. I think so. I'm going to hand it over to Adriana to get us started with the breakout rooms.
Great, thank you. So thank you for all your presentations. That was really inspiring. Now I'm excited to see what you all discussed in the breakouts. And thank you, Kate, for moderating this section of the event as well. So for the breakouts themselves, we will focus on sort of what the authors have developed here, a title, problem, solution, and implementation that you're thinking of, similar to the panelists, and then thinking through how that applies to this broad challenge. We will have a Google Doc where the panelists and note takers will have access to edit. I'll actually just put the topics in the chat so you can see sort of what are the different options, and this will be discussed in the breakouts as well. So we'll have each room will be moderated by one of our panelists, and then they'll be able to share their screen and you all can discuss ideas. And then we'll come back here in about 20 minutes to talk about, just give a brief final takeaway, after which we'll summarize all these ideas into a document to actually submit to OSTP next week. So I'm excited to hear your ideas, and I'll just go ahead and open the rooms if there are no questions. Great. All right, so welcome back. I know that was short, but hopefully you have time to get through some ideas. So before we close, just quickly, if we can go around and have each person say something that you took away from the room, starting with Andrew.
Okay, so I was just looking at our notes, thinking about that. So we talked about how because of sort of economies of scale or administrative support, smaller schools, smaller communities have difficulty, pursuing these competitive grants and then administering them, whether that's a science research or, Department of Ed grant. And so we discussed, maybe there's some way to create a more centralized form of support. Either we could change and make those less competitive in some way, or create a more centralized resource where folks could get more help, developing a grant proposal or administering, their grant or whatever the case may be, to try to level the playing field a little bit. And so that was an interesting idea that we discussed.
Great, very helpful, thank you. Lindsay?
Yeah, actually, we also talked a little bit about grants, but from a bilingual point of view, that a lot of people, even if they approach the higher levels of academia, they don't have the option to even write proposals in their native language. And so along the lines of what we were talking about with an interagency working group that collects information about different languages, it can be very useful to accept grant proposals in different languages, but also Shakia brought to my attention that there are some universities already that set a precedent for dissertations to be written in languages other than English. So if there's already a precedent, we were talking about expanding that and kind of just from a larger level, domino effect of shifting the tides of academia and kind of creating pressure from the bottom up. And so Mohammed was bringing up ideas to network in different languages at conferences and things like that. Just really shifting the tides from all levels of academia put together. And I thought it was really great. We had a really good discussion.
That's great, great to hear, thank you. And Jeremy?
Can you move closer to your microphone, Jeremy? It's not picking up.
No, can't hear you. Okay, now a little bit.
Nicole, do you want to pitch it and give a quick summary? Or if not, I can't.
Oh, yeah, sure. I was just sorry. I was trying to listen because I thought I could hear him a little bit at the end. So we basically, our discussion focused mainly around the identification of stakeholders. So again, Jeremy's proposal is kind of focused on, or his paper, it focused on the thought that the benefits of science, especially like maybe some basic research, isn't translated to society, and then U.S. representatives may not really see the benefits of funding science research. And so to try to get the public involved in the review of proposals and what gets funding, so that we can ensure that there's some social impact. And again, our discussions kind of largely focused on who would these stakeholders be, how would we get people involved, how would that advertising be done, and it seems like there's a lot of questions there that have to be answered, before we could think about that. So Sonia and Kate, feel free to chime in on anything I missed.
Hold on, I think I got it back.
Yeah.
Yeah, Linux decided to fuck around. Yeah, thank you, that was a great summary. I will just add at the end, something that I didn't say in the breakout room is that we're never going to get this perfect for every single
type of research, especially the way that technology's effects can cascade over time and across different stakeholders. The idea is not to say that, you know, we're always going to know exactly who's going to be affected by all these particular technologies, but just understanding that we've got enough of a cross-section for every research proposal that we can consider most of the potential ideas about where this can go.
Yeah, so
Right.
the only thing that, oh,
Go ahead.
the only thing that I would add to that is that I think it's a really fantastic idea. And I think the devil is really in the details because it's so hard to make sure that you're getting the right balance of stakeholders. But it is so important to get their impact.
You know, on that note, I know, is it possible for us to continue contributing to the Google Doc in the next couple of days before you start to summarize it, Adriana?
Yes, I'll share that with the group and write down who was in which room so you all can continue. It's due next Friday, so happy to continue working on it as a group as well. So hopefully this was helpful. I'm really excited that we're able to get your ideas in this document. And like I said, we will submit this next Friday to OSTP, and also looking to write a blog post summarizing some of these views, sort of again from the authors, but all of you here today as well. So thank you for that. So I just want to wrap up with one of our next issues coming up. Okay, so earlier this week was National STEM Day. So given that and our overall topic, I want to just draw your attention to our current call for papers on re-envisioning STEM education and workforce development for the 21st century, which I think fits in well with today's topic as well. This is leading up to our special issue with Sigma Xi. The deadline is January 23rd. And again, another good opportunity to get your ideas out there as far as the future of science policy within education and workforce development. So looking forward to your submissions there, and we'll place that link in the chat as well. So thank you again for participating today. Thanks again to Kate for moderating, and we'll be in touch for the summary. Thanks.